We're talking about things like lifestyle, we're talking about compensation, and sometimes we're told, hey, suck it up. Sometimes work is a grind. Hey, comp is something that should be a lagging, not leading indicator. You always want to build skill. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is you should get paid and you should be paid fairly. And it creates a lot of stress when you're not. And it causes you to have short tenures and worry. And if you can't do good work because you're burning out, because it's asking too much, and you're a horrible person at home and you're having to make some trade-offs, we should probably talk about that. We shouldn't just say that the biggest job at the best company is the one that we always need. I'm like, no. This is a marathon, not a race. Pick the right company for who you are now, not who you used to be, not who you want to be. Be realistic, because there is still a job. That's great. That fits into your constraints and your expectations. It's just that you need to make thoughtful decisioning. So if you look at sort of this comp, skills, lifestyle, success, environment, these are kind of the traits that I would want to have everyone think about when they're thinking about stay versus go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Skip Podcast. I'm your host, Nikhil Singhal, and I'm with Carly Malatskey. She and I are going to talk about the next Mailbag episode, another question that came in, and it falls into this sort of stay versus go category of, should I take this new job or should I stay at my current job? And I figured because it's the beginning of the year and a bunch of you have spent the holidays thinking through what's the right thing to do. Should you stay? Should you go? The environment's kind of crazy. I thought this would be a great one for us to pull out. So Carly, over to you. Let's talk through this Mailbag episode.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to read it out like I did last time. I'm at one of those ex-growth companies, which was growing nicely a few years ago and raised at a high valuation. But these days, we're trying to restart growth and are worried that we'll see further headwinds from the disruption coming from AI. I'm the head of product, but I've been looking for a new role for most of the year. One interesting company came up. I'm in the Bay Area, and this is an East Coast public company that's publicly traded. Solid team, number 2 role working for the head of product. The pros are I'd work on an AI product and work in a new market. And the stock is liquid compared to my current role, which is still private. The downside is the company stock price has taken a big hit from its peak a few years ago. The headquarters is on the East Coast, and I would be one of the very few leads on the West Coast, which isn't my preferred working style. I'm not in a huge hurry to make a decision, but it feels like this role is better than my current one. What's your take on stay versus go? Okay, so you even mentioned it, but this question almost boils down to when is good enough good enough? So if the next role is better than the current role in, some important ways, should you pull the trigger or should you keep searching?
The answer is always it depends. There's no material out there that you can read and say, oh, that exactly applies to my situation. So what I feel we need to do in this episode is, because it's a common question, we need to help people kind of think through a framework to be able to make decisions on, when is your current job worth leaving? When is the new job worth joining? And when does sort of the levels kind of even out to be able to make that decision? But it's that framework and job searching thinking that we need to kind of really relay in this episode.
Okay, perfect. So like you said there's a framework, but before we even get into the specifics, I actually have more broad questions about job searching in general that I'd love for you to give your take. And one of those is, how active do you think people should be in job searching? Should we always be passively searching for a job in case something comes up, or how do you reconcile that?
I mean, I probably meet 5% of people that are like, oh, I kind of really like meeting people through interviewing. And I would say about 1 out of every 20 are into that, which means 19 out of every 20 find the whole freaking thing exhausting. And I generally don't love the idea of constantly being on the hunt. Maybe it's sort of like dating. I mean, I think that, you should sort of focus and settle down and try to make your relationships work, as opposed to just constantly be pushing for next. I also think it affects kind of your vibe at your current job when you're constantly like, oh, I'm here, but there's always another job before me. Having said that, my broad framework here is that we should make sure that every person listening to this podcast episode has a sense of, is their job that they're in today career additive? And the concept of being career additive is kind of our core focus point. If it's career additive, then I think you should absolutely continue to stay in your current company. But if it's not career additive, meaning like if you were to stay for another couple of years, the stories you'd tell would roughly look the same, or maybe the compensation would be under market, or you're not really building a skill that is going to really apply anywhere else. Well, that's concerning. And now the question is, if you're in a job that's not career additive, you probably should be talking to other people and looking elsewhere. And depending on how acute the problem is, you might want to accelerate your timeline. But my sense is you should be only kind of chatting with folks in the side if you're, in a non-career additive role. Now, the second thing I would just say to answer this question is sometimes it's useful to know like where you stand in the market. And so if, for example, you're 10 to 15 years in career, you've had some success, you're thinking maybe your next job is head of product, but you're feeling pretty good about your current gig, maybe one thing you might want to do is check with companies that are recruiting head of product and actually talk to them, perhaps even interview to see where you stack up. And let's say in that example, the company says, well, we feel, that yes, you're interviewing for head of product, but we're worried that you don't have a strength in, technical analytical skills. And that's kind of a prerequisite. Maybe you hear that a couple of times in your kind of early exploration. Then boy, you know what? I should try to make sure I acquire those in the next 1 to 2 years in my current company. So if you're given a choice within moving to another role and staying, maybe you go and find that skill, which will help you. Or maybe they'll say, you've never worked for a company that's relatively large and successful, and that's a big problem. And then you might realize, maybe head of product isn't my next job. Maybe I need to think differently. So that's where kind of interviewing, but very strategically can help. But generally, it's for a reason. And networking, using the kind of general term of meeting other folks, can be just as helpful than doing the formal interview in the second case that I described.
Bit of a follow-up question to that. You mentioned how determining whether it's career additive. Do you find that some people are maybe too hasty to make a decision, meaning that they join a company, they give it maybe a month to see like, oh, this is not it, and I should start looking for a job. It's not what I expected. Versus like, do you think there should be a set timeline to say like a month is too soon? You need to give it at least 6 months before you make a decision saying this is accurately how the work is and it's not for me.
I took a call like this last year, and the call was, I think I made a mistake. And I get a few of those. And what I would say is that you would put your blinders on for 100 days, with the exception of values. So like, let me go through the edge case and then I'll take the normal case. So the edge case is you join and you're like, hey, I think they cook the books. I think that they don't believe women should be leaders in this company. Like stuff like that. Yeah. I'm like, time to go. It's just like,
because that won't change. That's like a set thing that probably won't change. Okay.
And it shows the character of the company. The character of the company is that they withheld information, and that this is only going to be the starting point. It never gets better. It's not like, oh, that was like a one-time event. It's just like there's bad stuff there. So sometimes you can't tell until you go through the sort of threshold of the doorway to know what's behind. And there's always going to be quote unquote hair on the deal. So there's always going to be some, something under the rock when you lift it up, there'll be some issue. But if it's very value driven, I would say, I just think that life is too short to work for companies that have weak values. Having said that, when you pull it up, there's going to be things like, the role that I signed up for isn't quite there. Maybe the health of the company isn't quite where it needs to be. Maybe the founders are more tightly held on what they want to do with the company, or my boss has a very strong point of view, and this idiosyncrasy and working style may not be right for me. Give it 100 days, because they're also adjusting to you as much as you're adjusting to them. And after 100 days, you don't gain that much by giving it an additional amount of time. Now, if it turns out that you're really, really shocked by what you see, and you had another company that was a finalist, maybe it is better for you to just sort of say, hey, I now know what I know and make a move. But these are pretty rare. 6 months is maybe slightly longer than I would normally give. I would say 100 days. Not as much changes between 100 days and 6 months in terms of understanding the environment. In 6 months, you might be able to deliver your first thing. It's hard to deliver in your first 100 days, depending on the scale of the company. So that's where I'm like, you're in that range. But generally, if you're going to start your search over again, you're not losing that much by taking a little extra time, and maybe you'll learn. And you always learn the most when the company's doing great and not really well and not in between. So if the company's really dying, maybe you'll learn something, and that'll help you as well.
So follow-up question to that is I'm actually curious on the employer side, how it's viewed when people jump around. And what I mean by this actually is even on She Leads, on my podcast, I have a lot of senior women who, in their career, they've been at their, previous jobs for 8+ years, 10 years. Nowadays, it's very rare to see that. You see people, probably 2 years on average, they're jumping around. How is that viewed?
30, 40 years ago, it's pretty normal for people to have like 1 or 2 companies on their background. And now I think to your question, the average tenure is like 2.5 years, which means the average means that there's going to be some people that are, less than that and some people that are more than that. I kind of look at sort of impact and storytelling. So the question is, if you came to me and said, hey, I'm thinking about making a move, and yet one of the reasons I'm worried about it is I've been at my last 3 companies for 2 years each. And then your question, and to be more concrete, is to say, is this going to be negative on my background? And I would say, look, Carly, if you're, rising quickly and you're outpacing the company, and you tell me that, well, at company 1, I deliver this, and then at company 2, I deliver this, and at company 3, I deliver this. And in each of those cases, they were bigger problems and they were better solutions than the previous one. But I just kind of outgrew the company. The company was moving like at this pace, and I was just like, there wasn't as much headroom, or the problems weren't as interesting, or I took a lot of risk when I joined these companies, and these companies naturally, some of them worked out, some of them didn't. I would say, no, I think you're being thoughtful about career, getting what you need out of it and moving on. If on the other hand, we start hearing like, you just didn't fit, and so you keep moving around because you're not fitting. I'm like, I definitely think you shouldn't be trying to force fit into a company if you feel like it's not career additive, going back to my earlier comment. But if it's like a pattern, it's been 2 or 3 companies, then maybe it's not them, maybe it's you. And maybe you need to grind it out. And maybe the value exists by grinding it out. Now, I also think that the larger the company, the longer it takes to really have impact. So one of the pieces of advice I give is that, look, if you're in a growth startup, you should be in a position where you would see impact in, say, 6 to 12 months. But if you're in a late stage company, like the Facebooks and the Google, it's not uncommon for those companies to really require you to be in year 2 or even year 3 before you really have some of the bigger impact. Because there's so many people to know, there's so much, the way that they build product is very unique. It just takes a long time. So when you describe, some of the people that you've had on your show who are very, very senior executives, it's not surprising that it took them 4 or 5 years to build the trust with their peer set and their layer leadership above them for them to give, more of an opportunity for them to bet and risk on them. And then once that happens, they deliver it, et cetera. So there is value in staying. But I think that even in their case, their story every year or 2 was different. They were solving a bigger problem, something that was more important, and they were having greater impact. And in that case, every year is career additive and made perfect sense.
Given that nowadays LinkedIn is such a powerful tool that people, kind of create their own narratives just by looking at a LinkedIn profile, is that something that people should tailor towards, of almost wedging in a storyline? Or, because what about the people who can't afford to give that storytelling and that narrative to it if it's just, on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I think that the resume/LinkedIn optics are sort of very much around, here's a classic. This is the company. This is how successful the company was. This was my role. And then this was the product that I was on. And this is how successful it was. And you and I both know that there are going to be like some top performers and there are going to be some bottom performers, and they're going to have exactly the same paragraph written about LinkedIn. And there's going to be actually no difference. So my preference when I interview, less maybe looking at it from a resume point of view, but when I interview, I'm always asking people, like, tell me the problem you solved, what was hard, what opinions you held, how did you overcome, did you fail to overcome, et cetera. That's the best way to determine it, because there are going to be exceptional people at bad companies and exceptionally bad people at good companies. And these days, that's really the question is, what is the story? And then the reverse side is, if your story is not good, that means you're not getting in a career additive position. And if the story is quite good, then that means that you're gaining something, even if the company may not be doing great. And,
Yeah.
not everyone's going to have the time. If you're interviewed by an AI, maybe they won't get the, nuance or whatever. But generally speaking, that's the thing you want to optimize is, am I building a career story that's really helpful? So, I mean, if you think about some of these best senior executives that are, part of our community and then we work with, the folks that when you sit down with them, they're just like, here's the story I did at this company. Here's the story I did at this company. And then the products are increasingly more impactful. They're much harder problems. And you can just hear like, well, we had these choices and we made these decisions and I had these opinions and this one worked out and this one didn't. And then I moved to this next thing. This next thing was a completely different problem set and we were able to overcome. And then at some point you're like, wow, this person, no matter how big of a problem we tend to give them, they figure it out. Like, my problem seems small in comparison. They're definitely someone we want to bring on board. That's the way to break through the branding, the tenure, the sort of simple LinkedIn math. And it doesn't mean you have to get in the door. I get it. But then once you're in the door, it's these stories that really make the distinction between candidates.
Perfect. That's great. Okay, let's dive into this mailbag question. First, lay the framework. Like you mentioned, what is the framework that you use? And then we'll go into more details for each element of it.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of remind people, this person's trying to decide between, they're in a growth company today, maybe arguably an ex-growth company. So this company was doing well, is what I'm reading, but now isn't doing quite as well. And they're in a role that maybe they're in a leadership role, but they're like, maybe this isn't a great company. So my story is sort of flatlining. And they have this other role, which is not as senior of a position, but it's a pretty different market. It's a different compensation structure. And obviously it's located differently. And so now they're trying to calculate, like, how do you compare the two, right? So I tend to use, when I think of this type of question, I'm like, well, I want to understand compensation. I want to look at skills. I want to make sure I understand the lifestyle choice between the two companies. I very much want to know, like, can the person succeed? What kind of story they'll tell is another way of describing that. And then what is generally the environment that they're going to fall themselves in? So if you look at sort of this comp, skills, lifestyle, success, environment, these are kind of the traits that I would want to have everyone think about when they're thinking about stay versus go. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. So let's start with comp. And right now, the context that we have about comp, they don't really give a base salary, anything like that, but they do mention how this stock is liquid. So walk me through, what should people consider regarding comp when they're considering stay versus go?
Yeah. So I think that, broadly speaking, you're sort of running an A/B test in this case. You've got an A, which is the stay. What's the comp you make today? And then a B, which is what would be the comp in the next one. And I happen to list it first. It may not be the most important one, but it, frankly, is probably one of the easier ones to compare. And so in this example, you've got someone who's, getting privately held stock, exactly as you point out. And the stock used to be higher value than it is today because the company raised when the market was really hot. And now it's not as much. So there's some questions as to, like, how valuable is the equity going to be worth? And that's a big chunk of this compensation package. And then you've got this other company that you're going to come in and, it is public. And so it's essentially liquid comp. And the sort of the two factors that now we're thinking through is, today, in either case, is it above, at, or below your market rate? So let's say in this case, the person made $1 million a year, going back to our previous episode, if the person stayed in 2025, are they going to make their market? So let's say that this person was to stay throughout the year and then eventually leave, and their expectation is it's probably going to pay them, in good faith, $500,000. And then they're taking another role, and that role is exactly $1 million, and it's like liquid. Then I would say, well, okay, we believe that said individual should be making $1 million a year. They're making half that in their current gig, and they're making the full amount in the next gig. And maybe that company, the stock fluctuates and maybe it'll go up or go down. But my general and broad point is that's like a 2x difference. So that to me is like, one, we see quite a difference in the compensation. Now, on the other hand, if the second job was also paying $500,000, then maybe you would argue that that's their market rate. Maybe you would argue that they're roughly the same. And both of these jobs are below the $1 million, number that we described earlier. So what we're really trying to do is like, are you being paid below market? And how do these compare to your market rate is a big core question. And in this example, I think what we're saying is we're probably making below market. The other job is going to pay more because of its liquidity and the fact that you can guarantee the equity is going to be able to be traded. And now the secondary question when it comes to comp is, what's this person burn rate? Let's say that the person's like, well, I need to make $700,000 to not dip into savings, just given our family situation and expectation. I'm like, well, boy, the current gig is below that. You expect, even if you take out the fact that some of your equity is not liquid, you're probably making like a couple $100K and then hoping the equity works itself out. And you're saying the best case scenario is it makes like $200,000-300K additional. You're way under your expectations. You're burning a lot of savings. That's sort of in the red, but let's say the person on the other hand is like, actually, I don't need more than 200 or 300. I'm making that much liquid for my current gig. I think I'll make more with the equity. This one also is going to pay much more, but that one's letting me like solid green and I'm like light green. Then I would like, let's move to something else. I'm just trying to figure out like, are you burning a ton of cash in either of these roles? And are you like clearly over or underpaid compared to your market rate is really the two questions that I would push on.
Okay. Because it seems like at the end of the day, when you are comparing the two, you also are thinking, how much does comp play compared to the other things that I'm optimizing for? Do you find that it's still quite rare to have comp be the main, maybe number one lever that people look at? Because even in this mailbag, right, they mentioned the title, the location of it, and all these other factors. So how do you advise people to think of comp in the greater framework?
Yeah, I'm looking for outliers. What we're doing is we're sort of fishing for outliers. So an outlier in this example would be, individual in this case is like burning tons of savings and currently in the current role, or would burn tons of savings in the new role. That kind of immediately becomes the core question, like, can you afford to stay? Can you afford to go? On the other hand, if we're like, hey, both of these roles are basically paying me under market, then I'm like, okay, we should definitely look at some of the other factors. Or if it's like one of these roles is like hugely advantageous, like I have this conversation come up all the time. Hey, I've been in this current position. I've been burning a little bit of savings. If I take this other role, like I had this come up recently where a person's like, I'd been under my current comp value for 8 solid years. I'd worked for 8 years and I had taken a job at a privately held company. And that company had, essentially paid me its minimum, 150, 200K, and then given me a huge amount of equity. But after 8 years, we're winding the company down. And in that example, the person's like, I'm going to value going to a liquid salary. And I don't know if I care about the other 4 factors in your framework because I'm like feeling so behind. It's causing so much stress. I'd rather just get something that is liquid that I can guarantee pays me market. Do that for a couple of years and then I can take greater risk. So these are the outliers that I'm kind of pushing on. I'm like, okay, in that case, if you can find something and it's a tolerable job, I'm not sure it needs to be that career additive. I just think you need to kind of restore. And maybe you could argue at year 4, maybe they should have made the move, 2020 hindsight. But my point is, these are the outliers we look at in this configuration. And then if there are no outliers, then we kind of look at it in an aggregate.
Before we go on to skills, I have the next part of the framework. I want to ask, how do people avoid falling into that trap to determine, I'm not being paid under my market rate? It seems like my natural instinct, and you mentioned it actually in the beginning of this episode, which is, take that call with the recruiter, maybe go through the interview process to see what you'd be paid. But are there other ways? Like, how do people, not fall into that trap and determine that they're being paid market rate?
So in this example, what happened is this person had taken a bet on a startup. It would be the equivalent of like, look, I'm going to join as a leader in a company, which is going to pay me less than my market rate, but it's going to give me a whole boatload of equity. There's situations where a person knowingly makes this decision. And then there's a situation where they're like, well, I thought it was going to be like my market is X. And in that example, yeah, it's joining a community, understanding how people get paid, looking at the information that's out there, but also just being like pretty cognizant of like, hey, is this equity instrument, which in this case, a lot of times it's like, well, I thought this equity was going to be worth something. You need to be really clear on like, what does that number need to be? And trying to essentially work with the company to determine like, is this really worth it? Now, again, this is only comp. Like it might be the case that, hey, I thought this thing was going to be worth 250K a year, and my guess is it's only going to be worth 50. That's kind of what the example is in this question. Then it's like, okay, then just let's make sure that the other things you're gaining are worth that trade-off. What I don't want people to do is say, well, I'm hoping it all works itself out. And then year in and year out goes, they don't think it's going to work out and they don't gain any of the other experience. That's when we're in the non-career additive zone.
So why don't we go now into another element of the framework, which is skills. What skills are you learning? How do you determine that?
Yeah. And again, it's sort of an inside the building, outside the building question. Outside the building is the easy one. Like if I'm looking at an A/B between stay versus go, one question is like, hey, are the skills you're picking up either in the current job or in this future job going to be great for the environment? You know, like an example would be, hey, I'm learning AI skills. Like we all can agree that that's helpful. You know, and again, AI skills can be everything from really the deep technical how AI is being built all the way up to like we're using AI all the time and we're becoming more efficient, which frankly I think is super, super helpful. And you could argue that one of these two jobs could be that, or something a little softer. Like I feel like my current job is a very, very hands-on role and I have a lot of stories to tell because I'm in the detail. And this next job is a little higher level. It's a little unclear as to what the expectations are. I'm like, that could go wrong because these days people want detailed, hands-on, in the weeds type leaders. And the sort of org builder manager type is less important. So I'm going to ask like, hey, skill wise, I'm trying to determine like, what are you picking up naturally? What do you think the next one's going to be picking up? Similarly, to succeed, sometimes you have to build some skills that are unique to the environment. So when you're at a company like a Google or a Meta, a lot of times you're learning their way of building product. And sometimes their way of building product is like, super, super valuable. Like I was talking to someone recently and they were saying like right now, a lot of people that are working at DoorDash are under great demand because DoorDash and Meta maybe 10 years prior were great growth environments. And they knew how to do product growth. So anyone that was in those buildings have a lot of experience in doing that type of work. So that's a very valuable skill that unique to DoorDash or Meta back in the day is now very valuable to the general environment. I'm sure working at OpenAI today is going to be very valuable for others. But there are companies that are also very idiosyncratic that are like, well, I'm spending a lot of my time convincing my boss's boss, and my boss's boss's boss how to get things done. I'm like, that's a good skill, but it really applies to later stage environments or companies at this mega scale. And if you have literally no interest in your next job being that, knowing that skill is like marginally translatable, but it's somewhat unique to the environment. Or let's say I'm spending a lot of time working in a detail around security. And I'm like not interested in working in this space again, but I'm building all of this detailed work. Like a friend of mine used to run the tax business at Credit Karma and became one of the best tax experts. And I'm like, if 90% of your energy is becoming a great tax expert, but like you're never going to work in tax again, you kind of have to ask yourself, like, is that career additive? Is that a skill that you really want to translate? Well, maybe learning how to work with like institutions is valuable, but tax is not. So you sort of need to look at what skills you're picking up from the internal and external, how esoteric and how translatable is the second part of this equation that I kind of scorecard. So I'm like, okay, in this example, comp felt like it was substantially better in the new environment as we don't think the equity is going to be very valuable. It's probably below market in the current situation. Second one, we're like, okay, skill-wise, his node is a sort of AI leaning and his current environment is maybe less so, but at the same time, he's a number one right now. So he's a leader, and there's a lot of very valuable things of being a number one where your peers are engineers and marketers as opposed to other product people. And this new job sounds like he's not a number one, sounds like he's going to be working with some other folks who are product folks. So it's maybe a little bit more like someone that worked in his own team. So it's step down. So maybe there's some like fungibility. So new product line, but perhaps not as senior, right? So that's kind of maybe that cancels itself out, but it's sort of in the zone is what I'm seeing.
What do you find are the best ways to try determine what skills you will be learning in that new environment if you were to join? Is it talking to just a bunch of people at the company, or do you have any like tangible advice to really learn, okay, if I join, this is a new skill I would learn and I have good confidence about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think sometimes it's a combination of the skills it takes to get things done in the company. You can kind of tell by the peers as to like what skills have they had, what background they've had. And sometimes it's a question of like the roles specifically and what the expectations of the manager is. So let's take the 70% case. Everyone knows that at Meta it tends to be very data oriented, less engineering driven, less technology driven in, say, their product management. So if you go and you succeed, there's a certain style of product that you need to be able to adhere to get things done. And it doesn't take much than just talking to the successful product people and just understanding like, how do you work? What are your skills? Where did you come from? And you'll figure that out. So I knew when I came in to Meta that they did product differently than I'd ever done before. The fact that I'd be good at data, I'd look at pre-read documents, I would be much more in the detail. They do a lot of system design, product makes a lot of the decisions. Like I knew that that's like how I would come out, or I would fail trying to come out that way. But that was a skill that I would need. And it was true. I mean, I built a ton of great skills that I wouldn't have gotten elsewhere. When I was at Google, it was very much an eng-driven culture with a very technology savvy product management team. So they built product through that technology lens. And I knew that's how I would end up having to deliver. That skill was similar to being a founder in my example. So it was relatively translatable. And the flip side of the question is, but if you're going to join, in this case, kind of an AI leaning project, maybe it's a 0 to 1 that they're looking for a new leader. Well, those are definitively a skill that maybe your peers don't even have that they're trying to bring in from the outside. And then the question is going to be very much focused on, hey, what are the expectations of the manager? And what's probably new to the company? Where do you need to hire from? And so it's a kind of a discussion there. But most of the time, you kind of get for free this sort of what's the stock? Who succeeds here? What have they done well? What have they done in the past? Is like the core thing that you almost can guarantee you're going to have to figure out.
Oh, I really like that. I like that question too. Almost just who succeeds here. And that's a good way to know of what skills you will get. Okay, let's go on to lifestyle. That was another element.
I think this is the one that I think hurts the new company the most in this specific example, because we had teed this up and we'd said, well, I've been at this current company for a couple of years. I know the people, maybe the company's slowed a little bit, but I kind of have a pretty clear expectation of what this 12-month looks like. I'm not sure I'm moving fast enough at this phase in my career, so I want to maybe take some more risk. But from a lifestyle point of view, there's a lot of known in this example. From this new company, there's an immediate West Coast, East Coast. I'll be one of the few people that are on my coast. I'm like, okay, that's not, let alone is it a new company and you're going to have to kind of surge to get to know the environment, the culture, the people. But you're also like a remote executive, which is in contrast to the current role. And then on top of that, it does seem like there's a fair amount of pace in this new company because it's a relatively urgent. It too has not been a pure every year growing. It also has had its challenges and it's a public company. So there's going to be a lot of pressure to make kind of expectations. In the same way we talked about comp as like clearly being substantially better here because it's liquid and it's probably at market. Lifestyle, I think, is substantially worse. I think a lot of people will be like, hey, I'm willing to take that. I can work hard, that. I'm like, yeah, but I think it's important to put on the scorecard because you might be better off choosing option C, the next company that we have yet to determine exists. And so part of me is like, is it worth taking a role that has such a substantive hit in lifestyle than taking a role that, may be like not yet identified, but available in June. And so that's the reason why I call out lifestyle in a pretty big way, that I think, every one of us has got constraints. And I want the role that you're considering, whether it's your current or the next one, to fit into those constraints. Work should fit into the constraints you give it, and it shouldn't just envelope everything. And by the way, this could be the flip. It could be, hey, I'm burning out and I just hate the environment I'm in. I'm just like a very negative person because I just feel like work has kind of overwhelmed me. And so then you're like, okay, well, that's a very urgent situation to remedy. Even a role that may be less career additive, but is dramatically simpler to measure and has a lot better lifestyle is worth considering. And I think that there's something to say that then bubbles up to the top. So again, outlier, lifestyle seems like an outlier in this example.
I also love how you also just like be honest with yourself. Like even if it's not good, like that goes on the scorecard. It's not great. And don't, push it aside just because it is a new opportunity that came up. And there are other things that maybe are more exciting. So we'll get into that because I'm curious of what you ultimately advise this person.
I want to double click on this point that you're making, Carly, because I think we're talking about things like lifestyle. We're talking about compensation. And sometimes we're told, hey, suck it up. Sometimes work is a grind. Hey, comp is something that should be a lagging, not leading indicator. You always want to build skill. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is like, look, you should get paid and you should be paid fairly. And it creates a lot of stress when you're not. And it causes you to have short tenures and like worry. And if you can't do good work because you're burning out, because it's asking too much and you're a horrible person at home and you're having to make some trade-offs, we should probably talk about that. We shouldn't just say that the biggest job at the best company is the one that we always need. I'm like, no. This is a marathon, not a race. Like pick the right company for who you are now, not who you used to be, not who you want to be. Be realistic because there is still a job. That's great. That fits into your constraints and your expectations. It's just that you need to make thoughtful decisioning. And the better job than the one you have today is not necessarily the best decisioning because there could be even a better one. That's the reason why we're kind of trying to break things down a little bit more scientifically here.
Okay, so there are two more that you mentioned in this framework. The next one is, will you succeed? How do you determine that?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite ones because it's like one of those questions that people don't ask is, how long do you think you'll be at the company that you're potentially in now or you'll be in the next? Like sometimes people are in a job where they're like, hey, I'm going to take this role and it pays me more. I think it fits into these other criteria. And I'm like, well, what are the chances that you succeed? And you're like, well, I'm absolutely going to succeed. I'm like, no. I totally get, put me in the game, coach, and all that. Like, I think we should look at this pretty carefully. In this example, there isn't another person who's held this role before. It's a relatively new initiative for the company, and they're looking for outsiders, and they're also struggling a little bit. So they need this initiative to succeed, and they're trusting someone who's never been at the company, who doesn't know anyone. And in your case, this particular individual that's asking us the question, just generically, no matter how good the person is, it's like a 50-50 shot that this thing even works itself out. So, where that matters is if you have a relatively high chance of succeeding in your current role, and it's in this case a number one position, but there's a relatively low chance that this new role will work itself out. What I'm nervous now is the person is going to come in a year or year and a half and be back in market. And that isn't as valuable as something that's a higher chance of success that has some of these other characteristics. So this one I would say is high risk, partly because it's new for the company and they're trusting an outsider, big kind of flag, partly because it's like a tough lifestyle. Like, to succeed, you need to have relationships. Person's going to be on the other side of the coast. They may not be able to be there for 6-12 months. You're the only one that's like that. So immediately our human nature is as the outsider. It's a new thing. So they didn't choose to trust someone who's in the building. So all those people are like, well, I can't believe that I've been on this like project for so long and I don't get to do the new thing because we're trusting this guy. I hope this person succeeds. Expectations are a little out of whack. So I'm like, okay, success matters. And again, the same thing applies to current role. If you're a head of product of a company that's not going to make it out, then that's also worrisome. And then you won't have as much to show. And maybe you should be more likely to look elsewhere. So success and the potential of success, I know it's sometimes hard to know, but I'm going to probe as to like, how likely is this going to win? Are you going to win? Because winning is this part of the storytelling. You want to be able to say, I was working on something, it was hard, and I succeeded, or I learned. And if you can't really say that in one of these two cases, it's sort of not career additive. And going back to our original point, that's a problem.
And I think what you touched on as well, in terms of will you succeed, is it's not even just the tangible, concrete skills. Are you shipping products? Are you doing that for the company? But it actually can be this all-encompassing question of, you are remote and you may not like being remote. You may have, burnout, like all these motivations that can come into it of like, will you be putting your best foot forward in a way? So there's like other factors that can come into it that you already talked about in the framework.
I'm almost fast forwarding to the conversation we may have with said individual in 15 months. And in 15 months, here's my bet. The conversation is going to be like, I took the role and it was really tough. I pushed really hard, but in the end, the problem was very tough for the company to go and create something new. They hadn't done it before. There was an urgency that was needed. In about 6 to 8 months, I was asked by my manager to sort of be layered under someone else who had been at the company for a long time. After that, the company had decided that they just needed someone they could trust who knew how to operate. And the role wasn't quite what I had in mind. And then I was realizing I was flying back and forth and I wasn't able to deliver on the thing that I wanted. And I just decided it wasn't for me. So I'm like, is that a 10%, 50%, and 90% chance that that's the conversation? And my sense is, I don't think this company really knows that they can't ask someone new on a different coast to go do this thing. And they're going to figure it out in this 12 months. And, this candidate might be roadkill. So I think it's like in the 50% case, they probably should have given it to someone at the company, because the hard part wasn't cracking the code on the industry. It was teaching the company to do something new for the first time. And that was really hard. And there's no way an outsider in my situation would have worked it out. And then the thing that's going to be in my head is like, could we have guessed that was going to happen when you took the job? And my job is to figure out what are all the things we could guess related to success right now. And my calculation is 50% chance the company probably shouldn't make this hire. And you're going to be the one that they're going to experiment on. And that's too high of a risk. So that's why lifestyle was a factor, but success is like, boom, that's the one that we're focusing and I'm discussing with this individual.
So we're getting a good sense of ultimately what you advised this individual. And we're going to wrap it up with that. But to wrap up even the framework question, the last thing is environment. So like current job, the job search, how much time they've been looking. How do you weigh that for the person?
Yeah, I mean, this is an intangible on the current. Like, how bad does a person want to get out of there? And then how much am I telling them that, hey, suck it up versus like, it sounds bad. Again, I get really pokey when someone comes in with values. Hey, I think that the company is like mistreating me, and that can be like paying me 10 cents on the dollar to my managers, second guessing. I'm like, look, we're in tech, life is too short. You should be able to find a better gig. Let's translate that into some exit package. But for the most part, a lot of times people are like, yeah, I'm not sure that this company's going anywhere. And I'm like, yeah, but if you're making money and you optimize the next job search by an extra 3 months, that's totally worth it. So usually I'm like trying to figure out how bad is the current environment. And then I'm also next trying to figure out like, okay, if you've been in market, have you been in market for 6 months and interviewed with like 10 companies and have mostly not heard positive results? Then if the person comes in and they're like 1 out of 10 did come back with this, I'm like, 6 months, person's not in an awesome environment, definitely going to make money on comp, maybe 50% chance they fail, but I'm not sure in 6 months we're going to get dramatically better result. Like another company that's like massively better, I might be more inclined to say, move forward. But if on the other hand, the person's like, this is my first offer and I got it in 3 weeks. And I'm like, look, the data probably shows you'll probably get more. I mean, this is probably not a unique situation and you've got time. I do think that this is kind of the most obvious of all the factors, but this is a factor that like, what's the market? What are you people seeing in you? How bad is it today? Do I need to get this person to grind it out to really do a real search? And then in the new environment, is the environment filled with good people who, even if the company didn't work itself out, they clearly are hiring some of the best and the brightest? Or are you like the smartest person at that company? And if I'm like, okay, well, let me get this straight. You're literally the smartest person at this company. The chances that you're going to really learn are going to be a little less from your peers. And your current company, you have good people, but not great people, but you can afford the time. That's kind of like maybe more leans to stay versus go. So in this example, I think the new environment's fine, but this person was seeing success in searches and generally was doing well in the company. Again, a number one, well liked. They could afford to take extra time.
In the end, I know you recommended to hold for 6 months. So, and you kind of touched a little bit of where that came from, but how did you determine that in terms of even like the timing? Like why 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, despite the comp being substantially better and the fact that it's AI, and that was another positive, most of the other factors were negative. Number one versus number two, I think is worth looking at. Chance of success and lifestyle were super, super negative. And in my opinion, if the person in this example is a Bay Area person, they're going to be able to find a local company that is a higher quality than the one that they're being suggested. And I think they should be able to find that company with liquid compensation. And I'm betting because they're still pretty early in search and seeing some success, that'll appear. And I just think that it's probably worth the extra few months than it is to sort of jump on this one, because I don't think the person's going to be able to stay for more than 2 years. And it's going to be a rough 2 years. And then I think that they'll be like, okay, I have a sort of an okay number one role and a not an awesome position. And then I'm going to have to deal with they're not feeling very successful. So I just didn't want to have to deal with that. So I was sort of like, feels like you should probably see what else is out there.
It's so interesting because when I first read this mailbag and what you advised them, in my mind, I was like, that must be a pretty hard pill to swallow, right? You see this almost gift in front of you. And yet you're telling them like, nope, don't open the gift. Don't accept the gift. And instead, hope that you have a better gift that comes around. So I'm curious, would you have given the same advice maybe if the market wasn't at a state where hiring is super rampant and maybe it's a bit more of a risk if another job would come?
Yeah. Or maybe even another way to describe it is, what would I have to believe to suggest to leave? There's probably two things that would have tipped me. I think one is if the person was just out of patience. They're like, I have to leave. Now it's a question around unemployed job search because they're done versus this bird in hand. And so I was not presented with that problem. I was presented with, I'm willing to kind of stick it out and I'm still open to searching. So when anyone comes to the end of their rope, they tend to make suboptimal decisions. And this was not the case, but it could have been. And then the second case is if I was more convinced this person could succeed, even if the lifestyle would have worked itself, I would have been like, hey, this is going to be a grind. You're going to have to do it, the East Coast thing for a couple of years, but I'm pretty sure you're going to win because your current background makes you perfect, or the company has a track record, or you're going to be working with some killer peers. I just don't think the person is going to succeed, but they could have succeeded if the company was slightly better set up. So that's why I would say that's the number one factor in this case.
I like that. I like that a lot. Okay, this has been great. You've given such tangible framework for how people can think about it. Is there anything else that we may have missed that you want to add on this whole overall topic of stay versus go?
I think maybe if I was to summarize things, the most important thing is always bet on yourself. In the end of the day, bet on yourself that, if you've gotten one offer, you may get another one. Bet on yourself that you can take on a big challenge, but you also have to recognize that sometimes a company is just set up against you or a role set up against you. So you want to always start with I'm betting on myself, but I'm being very wise as to that risk and whether it's overly constrained or not. And that's kind of the broadest sort of general takeaway that I pulled from this.
Last thing, I also really liked, it's almost thinking of what is the conversation in 15 months from now that you can have. And I think for me, when people consider, should I join a startup? Even when I had my own thought process of joining a potential startup, for me, it wasn't of, will the company succeed? Because those chances are so low, right? So I almost think great, even if it completely fails, I at least know I'll be learning so many skills that come with, running a startup, whether it's messy, whether it's not, all of these other things that happen. So again, it's almost how can you frame that in your mind to be like, can you walk away from it in 12 months being like, that was great because I learned so much that I anticipated I would learn?
Yeah, I think this is a great nuance. Like your point was the company may not have succeeded, but it was a very high personal success. And that we would weigh very much in favor, right? So this is a great example of everything's doesn't really lend itself to a book or a blog posting. And my hope is in today's conversation, you can kind of hear what it's like when I'm presented, like going through these nuances to eventually come to a conclusion. But more, it's like showing your work makes all the difference. And you want to be very open with yourself because all of these constraints matter and all of these different factors kind of weigh into the decision.
Perfect. This was a good one. It was a jam-packed one. I loved it.
Yeah. Thanks for your time on this one. Thanks for going through it so clearly.
Of course. Thank you.